Hello everyone. Before we get into tonight's drive, remember to like and subscribe to the channel and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. That helps YouTube keep sending you stories like this one. Now let's begin. Early that afternoon, the trip still felt simple and almost boring. The kind of drive meant to clear your head. The plan was to cross 2 states in one stretch. Just me, Cole, and Nina rotating the wheel, chasing that loose feeling you get when the road keeps unspooling ahead of you. Life at that point was steady but numb. Long work weeks, cheap takeout, and the sense that every day looked the same. A road trip felt like pressing pause, even if only for a weekend. The car smelled like gas station coffee, and the citrus wipes Nina kept using on the dashboard. We joked about playlists, missed exits, and how the navigation app always sounded annoyed. Nothing about the day hinted that it would stay with me this long. By early evening, the highway thinned out, traffic dissolving into long gaps of silence between passing cars. The navigation app rerouted us without warning, insisting we take a narrow exit that cut through farmland instead of staying straight. At first, it felt harmless. Rolling hills, endless fences, and fields that looked abandoned rather than worked. Cell service faded bar by bar until the screen showed nothing but the map and our blinking dot. Cole tapped the phone like that would fix it, laughing it off, but the laugh didn't last long. The road narrowed, asphalt cracking into uneven patches, and the sky started turning a heavy gray. We passed no houses, no stores, just mailboxes leaning at odd angles. Eventually, we reached a small cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. A gas pump with peeling paint, a lunch counter with one flickering light, and a handful of trucks parked like they'd been there forever. We pulled in relieved to see people at all. Inside the lunch counter, the air smelled like old grease and burnt coffee, and conversations died the second we walked in. The locals stared openly, not curious, just watchful. I asked an older woman behind the counter how to get back to the highway, keeping my tone friendly. He didn't answer right away, just looked past me toward the window, then muttered something about taking the long way around. Another woman shook her head, whispering that the roads weren't safe after dark without explaining why. When we stepped back outside, the sun was already sinking, shadows stretching too fast across the dirt lot. Cole pointed out that one of the trucks had started its engine as we left. The sound low and deliberate. As we drove away, another set of headlights appeared in the rear-view mirror, then another farther back. No one passed us. No one honked. They just stayed there, matching our speed. Nina tried the navigation app again, but the screen stayed frozen, useless. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the night settling around us. That was the moment the trip stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like a mistake. The farther we drove, the more deliberate it felt, like the road itself was closing in. The pavement thinned into gravel in places, tires crunching louder than they should have. The vehicles behind us multiplied until I counted 3 sets of headlights, spaced evenly, never drifting. Cole kept glancing at the mirrors, jaw tight, saying they were probably locals heading home, but his voice didn't match the words. Nina suggested turning around, but the idea of going back past that lunch counter made my chest tighten. There were no street lights, just our headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. Every farmhouse we passed sat far back from the road, windows black, as if no one lived there at all. We slowed near a fork in the road, unsure which way to go, and that's when one of the vehicles behind us flashed its high beams, sharp and sudden. Another did the same a second later, like a signal. Cole accelerated, dust kicking up behind us, and the headlights closed the distance almost immediately. One truck pulled alongside us just long enough for me to see a silhouette leaning toward the window, arm resting out the side before dropping back again. No one tried to pass. They didn't need to. They seemed content keeping us where we were. My thoughts kept circling the same question. Why not just let us leave? Nina spotted a faded sign half buried in weeds pointing toward the highway, or what we hoped was the highway. Cole took the turn without slowing, the car jolting as we hit a rougher stretch of road. The vehicles behind us hesitated for the first real time, engines roaring louder as they adjusted. One peeled off, disappearing down a side road, but two stayed with us. The road climbed a small hill, then dipped sharply, trees closing in on both sides. For a moment, the headlights vanished behind a curve, and the silence felt unreal, like holding your breath underwater. That relief shattered when the headlights reappeared closer than before. Cole pushed the car harder than he ever had, the engine whining in protest. The road straightened, and ahead, faint but unmistakable, were the reflective markers of the highway. As soon as our tires hit smooth asphalt, the vehicles slowed, then stopped altogether, their headlights cutting off one by one. We didn't slow down. We didn't look back. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of adrenaline and disbelief. Each of us replaying the same images in our heads, trying to make sense of something that refused to feel random. Once we stopped at a rest area, none of us got out of the car right away. The lights buzzed overhead, bright and sterile, and it felt wrong that other travelers moved around like nothing had happened. Cole finally killed the engine and just sat there, hands on the wheel, breathing slowly like he was trying not to shake. Nina broke the silence by saying the whole thing sounded insane out loud, which somehow made it worse. We replayed every second. The looks in that lunch counter, the way the trucks moved in sync, the silence when we asked simple questions. No one had a theory that made sense. We agreed on one thing only. That wasn't random. Later that night, at a motor inn we hadn't planned on stopping at. Sleep didn't come easily. Every headlight passing outside the curtains made me tense up, listening for engines slowing down. I started searching online, not knowing exactly what I was looking for, just typing fragments of what we experienced. Buried in regional forums and old news posts were mentions of stranded motorists, assaults that never led anywhere, people found injured on back roads with no memory of who helped or hurt them. The locations were vague, unnamed, but the details lined up in uncomfortable ways. The comments were worse than the articles. Locals warning outsiders not to wander, not to trust detours. Seeing it written by strangers made my skin prickle. The following morning, we decided not to report anything. That choice still bothers me. But at the time, we couldn't explain what happened without sounding unhinged. No plates, no faces, no clear crime, just fear and instinct. Instead, Cole altered the rest of the route manually, triple-checking every stop. Nina barely joked anymore, staring out the window like the landscape itself might turn on us. We stayed on major highways, ignored every suggested shortcut, and didn't stop unless there were crowds around. The trip ended early, not because of distance, but because none of us wanted to keep pretending this was still fun. What sticks with me isn't just the fear, but how coordinated it all felt. Those people didn't panic or rush. They controlled the pace, the silence, the road itself. Whatever happens out there doesn't rely on luck or opportunity. It relies on travelers trusting a screen to guide them somewhere unfamiliar. I still take road trips, but I plan them like a paranoid person. Now, offline maps, printed routes, and a hard rule to never follow a detour once service drops. Some places don't want visitors, and they make that clear in ways that never show up on a map. Story 2. That afternoon marked the fourth stretch of our drive across a wide, quiet part of the country where towns felt more like suggestions than places. The trip was meant to reset things for us. A low-budget escape after months of stress, juggling work deadlines and school schedules. We were tired of chain hotels and figured a small roadside lodge would give us a story to laugh about later. The listing promised clean rooms, hot showers, and old-fashioned quiet, which sounded perfect after hours of engine noise. My partner Mina was scrolling reviews while I drove, and none of them raised obvious alarms. The kids were restless but excited, counting down miles like it was a game. When the navigation app told us to turn onto a narrow gravel road, I can remember thinking how empty everything looked. Fields stretched out on both sides, and the silence pressed in the moment we slowed down. The lodge came into view like something paused in time, sitting back from the road with faded signage and windows dulled by grime. Paint peeled in long strips, and weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot as if no one bothered fighting them anymore. No cars were parked outside, not even near the entrance, which felt strange for late afternoon. A single figure stepped out from the office door, a man with a stiff posture and clothes that looked slept in rather than worn. He spoke politely but didn't offer small talk, keeping his answers short and his eyes drifting past us instead of meeting them. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour I couldn't place. Inside the office, half the lights were off and a dusty fan hummed without moving much air. We exchanged a glance, the kind that says, "You're noticing the same thing, but don't want to scare the kids yet." The room itself was functional, but unsettling, like it had been cleaned just enough to pass a glance. The curtains were heavy and blocked most of the daylight, making the space feel smaller than it was. While unpacking, I noticed a thudding noise coming from somewhere behind the building, irregular and low, as if something heavy was being shifted around. Mina tried opening a side door near the vending machines, only to find it locked from the outside, which didn't make sense for a guest area. Another door near the back stairwell was blocked the same way. When I stepped out to get fresh air, I caught sight of items tucked beside a maintenance shed, worn backpack, a child's sneaker, and a wallet sleeve cracked down the middle. They weren't trash, not arranged like garbage, but hidden, pushed out of sight. The noise started again, closer this time, and the skin along my arms prickled despite the heat. We didn't announce our decision, but it happened all at once. Mina quietly told the kids to put their shoes back on and grab their bags without asking questions. I walked to the office to return the key, and the man looked surprised, almost annoyed when I said we were leaving early. He didn't ask why, just took the key and slid it into a drawer already full of them. Back outside, the sky was beginning to shift toward dusk, shadows stretching longer across the empty lot. As we drove away, I checked the mirror more than necessary, half expecting headlights to appear behind us. None did, but the sense of relief didn't hit until the lodge disappeared from view. We never reported the place, mostly because we didn't know what to say without sounding paranoid. Even now, I think about those hidden belongings and wonder who they belonged to, and whether leaving before nightfall was the only reason we got back on the road safely. We kept driving until the road finally led us to a stretch with actual traffic, the kind where headlights pass often enough to remind you other people exist. No one spoke for a while, not even the kids, which told me more than questions ever could. The radio played softly, some talk show fading in and out as hills interrupted the signal. Every now and then, Mina would glance at me like she wanted to say something, then stop herself. My thoughts kept circling back to the locked exits, the way they weren't jammed or broken, but deliberately secured. That detail stuck with me more than the noise or the empty lot. It suggested planning, not neglect. By the time the sun dipped lower, the tension inside the car felt heavier than the luggage in the trunk. We pulled into a small gas station just before dusk, the kind with buzzing lights and a single cashier behind thick glass. While filling up, I noticed my hands still weren't steady, even though we were clearly out in the open. Mina took the kids inside to use the restroom, and I stayed by the pump, scanning the lot out of habit. A family minivan rolled in, then a pickup truck, and the normalcy of it all felt almost unreal. Inside, Mina mentioned that one of the kids had asked why the doors at the lodge were locked, and she'd brushed it off as an old building issue. The lie sounded thin, even to her own ears. We agreed not to stop anywhere isolated again that day, no matter how tired we got. As night settled in, the image of those items behind the building kept replaying in my head. They weren't weathered enough to have been there long, and they didn't belong together, which made it worse. I thought about going back earlier, convincing myself we were overreacting, but the idea of returning after dark made my chest tighten. At one point, Mina suggested calling a non-emergency line just to report the locked exits and the abandoned feel of the place. We talked it through and realized we had no concrete proof of anything, just instincts and fragments. Still, instincts exist for a reason, and ignoring them had never ended well for anyone I knew. We decided that if we saw the lodge listed again during the trip, we'd leave a warning review without accusations, just facts. We reached a larger town later that night and checked into a chain hotel that smelled like bleach and coffee. The relief was immediate and almost embarrassing, like we'd escaped something without knowing exactly what it was. The kids finally relaxed, laughing at the TV while eating snacks from a vending machine that actually worked. Mina and I stayed up longer than usual, replaying the day in quiet voices, making sure our memories matched. Nothing else happened that night. No calls, no strange encounters, just sleep that came hard but stayed. Even now, years later, I can't explain what that lodge was really used for. All I know is that leaving when we did felt like a decision that closed a door we were never meant to open. The next morning, the drive resumed under a pale sky, and the previous day felt unreal in a way that made details sharpen instead of fade. Every time we passed a turnoff toward open land, I felt a small spike of tension, like my body remembered something my mind wanted to shove. The kids asked if we could ever go back to a place like that lodge, curious in the way only they can be. And Mina answered quickly that some places just aren't meant for families. I replayed the man's expression when we returned the key, the way he didn't bother pretending to care. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like impatience, as if we'd interrupted a routine he expected to continue. That stuck with me more than the noise ever did. Routine implies repetition, and repetition implies others. For days later, once we were back home and the trip had officially ended, I tried to look the lodge up again. The listing was still there, photos unchanged, descriptions still cheerful and vague. I scrolled through recent reviews and noticed something unsettling. Gaps, weeks with nothing, then a sudden short, overly positive comment that read like it was written to fill space rather than describe a stay. I wrote a careful review of our own, sticking to what we experienced without speculation. I mentioned the lack of guests, the locked exits, and the belongings behind the building, choosing words that couldn't be brushed off as dramatic. Hitting post felt heavier than it should have, like tossing a note into deep water and hoping someone else would find it. Not long after that, the listing disappeared entirely. No explanation, no archived page, just gone. Mina noticed it first and called me over, and we stared at the screen longer than necessary. I checked other booking sites, different spellings, even the map location itself. The place still existed on satellite view, but no accommodation information came up anymore. That was the closest thing to an answer we ever got, and it didn't feel comforting. If anything, it confirmed that something about that lodge didn't survive attention. We talked briefly about contacting authorities again, but with no listing and no new information, it felt like chasing a shadow. Life moved on as it always does, but that day still surfaces in quiet moments. Sometimes it's triggered by a roadside sign advertising cheap rooms, or by a stretch of road where the silence feels too intentional. I don't tell this story to scare people away from travel or small towns. I share it because sometimes the safest decision doesn't come with proof or validation, just a strong internal warning. We trusted that warning and left while the sun was still up. Whatever happened at that lodge after dark or before we arrived remains unknown to us. And honestly, not knowing feels like the best possible outcome. Story 3. That empty road stays in my memory like a long breath I never finished exhaling. I was on a road trip with my friend Trent, heading across the state to clear my head after a messy few months at work. At the time, my life felt paused, like I was drifting between decisions, filling days with movement just to avoid sitting still. We weren't rushing anywhere, just driving, talking, stopping for gas when the tank dipped too low. The highway thinned out as the late morning went on, the scenery flattening into fields and distant tree lines. Radio stations faded one by one until static filled the car. It felt normal in that rural middle of nowhere way you don't question until later. Looking back, the quiet should have registered as a warning, but it didn't. The car gave out without drama. A sudden loss of power followed by a gentle roll onto the shoulder. Trent tried the ignition a few times while I popped the hood. Even though I know nothing about engines, the air smelled hot and dry, and the wind carried dust from the road into my mouth. My phone showed no service, not even a flicker of signal. Trent checked his too, then laughed it off, saying it was kind of nice to be unreachable. We decided to wait, figuring someone would pass eventually. Cars were rare out there, which made each one feel louder and more noticeable. That's when the van appeared for the first real time. It came from behind us, dark, cold, and older, with a rattling sound that lingered after it passed. The driver slowed just enough to look, his head turning toward us before the truck picked up speed again. A few minutes later, the same van came back from the opposite direction, slowing even more this time. Trent joked that the guy must be lost, but his voice didn't sound convinced. The third pass was slower than the second, the tires crunching on gravel near the shoulder. I noticed how the truck stayed aligned with us longer than necessary. When it finally pulled ahead, the quiet afterward felt heavier than before. We stopped joking. Then the van returned again, and didn't pass this time. It pulled over a short distance ahead of us, hazard lights blinking in an uneven rhythm. The driver stepped out slowly, wearing a work cap pulled low and boots that looked too clean for roadside work. He asked if we needed help, his voice calm, but oddly flat, like he was reading lines he'd practiced. Trent thanked him and said we had someone coming, even though that wasn't true. The man lingered, offering tools, a ride, anything that would get us into his truck. His eyes kept moving between us and our car, never settling long enough to feel normal. When we refused again, his expression hardened just a little before he nodded and walked back to his van. We waited until the sound of his engine disappeared before either of us spoke. We sat in the car with the doors locked, the windows cracked just enough to let air in. Time stretched in a strange way out there, every minute feeling both slow and rushed. I kept checking the road in both directions, expecting the van to reappear at any second. Trent tried to keep things light, talking about food we'd get once we reached civilization again, but he kept glancing at the rear view mirror. Another vehicle eventually passed, a sedan that didn't slow down at all, and for a moment that felt worse than being noticed. The sun started sinking lower, pulling long shadows across the asphalt. I realized how exposed we were. Two people stranded with nowhere to go if someone decided to stop again. The van came back just as the light began to soften into early evening. This time it slowed even more, almost crawling past us before stopping several car lengths behind. The driver didn't get out right away. He sat there with the engine running, window halfway down, watching us through the side mirror. Trent whispered that we should stay put and not react. When the man finally stepped out, he didn't smile or speak at first. He walked closer than before, close enough that I could smell oil and cigarettes on his clothes. He repeated the offer to help, his tone sharper now, less friendly. We told him again that we were fine, that assistance was on the way. He stared at us for a long second, too long, then returned to his truck without another word and drove off fast enough to kick dust into the air. After that, neither of us talked much. The silence felt intentional, like speaking might invite attention back to us. Eventually, a tow truck appeared from the opposite direction, its lights flashing in a way that felt unreal with relief. The driver was all business, hooking up the car and asking quick questions while I kept scanning the highway. I half expected the van to roar back into view before we left. As we pulled away, I looked back at the stretch of road shrinking behind us, trying to memorize every detail in case it mattered later. Trent let out a long breath and said he hadn't realized how tense he'd been until that moment. We ended up at a small town not far from there, waiting in a cafe while the car was looked at. The place smelled like grease and burnt coffee, comforting in its familiarity. While Trent talked to the mechanic, I scrolled through regional news on the cafe's weak Wi-Fi. That's when I saw it. A short article buried near the bottom of the page. It mentioned a string of recent roadside robberies along a nearby highway, all involving stranded drivers and a dark van that would circle back before the attacks. The descriptions matched too closely to ignore. I read it twice, then a third time, my chest tightening with each detail. I showed the article to Trent, and the color drained from his face as he read. The robberies hadn't happened far from where we broke down, and the pattern was almost identical. Victims had accepted help or rides, thinking they had no other option. The article didn't say whether anyone had been caught. We paid our bill and left without finishing our food, both of us quiet during the rest of the drive. Even now, I think about how easily things could have gone differently if we'd made one small choice. That day taught me how thin the line is between an inconvenience and something much worse, especially when you're alone on the road. The rest of the drive felt longer than the miles on the map. Every van truck we passed made my shoulders tense, even hours later, when the scenery changed and traffic picked up. We didn't play music. We didn't talk about what almost happened. It was like acknowledging it might give it more weight than we were ready to carry. When we finally reached our destination, exhaustion hit all at once. The kind that comes from being alert for too long. That night, I kept replaying the man's pauses, the way he lingered. The fact that he'd come back more than once. None of it screamed danger on its own, but together it formed something unmistakable. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop checking news updates from that area. Several more reports surfaced. Then nothing. No arrest, no closure. Trent and I talked about it once more, sitting in silence afterward, both of us knowing how close we'd come without ever agreeing on the details. He admitted he'd considered getting into the truck just to end the waiting. That scared me more than the stranger ever did. It made me realize how vulnerability changes your judgment, how exhaustion and isolation can make bad ideas feel reasonable. I started carrying extra water, a paper map, and a roadside kit after that trip. Not because I thought preparation would make me fearless, but because I never wanted to feel that powerless again. Sometimes I still picture that highway, how wide and empty it was, how easy it would have been for something terrible to unfold without witnesses. The scariest part wasn't the man or the truck, but how ordinary it all felt while it was happening. No dramatic moment, no clear signal, just a slow, tightening sense that something wasn't right. Even now, I don't know what the driver intended or how many people didn't get as lucky as we did. Maybe he was involved. Maybe he wasn't. All I know is that we left that road intact because we trusted our instincts and stayed put. Even when waiting felt unbearable, that experience changed how I see quiet places and helpful strangers. Some stretches of road don't forgive small mistakes, and some warnings don't come with sirens or signs. They come as repetition, patience, and the feeling that someone is watching a little too closely. Story 4. Around 1:40 in the morning, my buddy Tyler and I were about 5 hours into what was supposed to be an 11-hour drive from Fort Collins to St. Louis. We had left after his shift ended at the warehouse, figuring we could split the driving and make it by noon the next day. Neither of us had slept much the night before. Him because of work, me because my mind was racing about seeing my dad in the hospital. Tyler was behind the wheel when he started drifting just slightly toward the shoulder. I told him to pull over before he killed us both. We had passed the last real rest stop maybe 35 miles back, but there was this little turnoff coming up on the right side of the highway. No sign, no lights, just a gravel patch carved into the trees. Tyler pulled in and parked near the edge where the gravel met the grass. The plan was simple. Sleep for a couple of hours, then keep moving. We both got out to stretch. The air was cold for October. That kind of cold that sneaks into your jacket and sits against your skin. Tyler walked toward the tree to take a leak while I paced around the car, trying to shake off the stiffness in my legs from sitting for so long. Our headlights were still on, cutting two pale beams into the darkness ahead. That was the moment I noticed the ground right there, maybe 25 feet in front of our car. The gravel was torn up. Fresh tire marks, deep ones, like someone had peeled out in a hurry. The soil next to them was disturbed, too, pushed around in uneven mounds. I can remember thinking it looked wrong, like someone had been digging or dragging something heavy. I called out to Tyler, told him to come look at this. He zipped up and walked over, and we both just stood there staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. Tyler pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam was weak, but it was enough to see more than we wanted to. The tire marks were fresh. I mean, really fresh. The edges of the grooves were still sharp, not worn down by wind or rain. Whoever made them had been here within the last hour, maybe less. We followed the tracks with the light, and they curved hard toward the tree before disappearing into the grass. That was the moment I caught the smell. It was faint at first, kind of sweet and chemical, like gasoline mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Tyler smelled it too because he stopped moving and just stood there with his phone pointed at the ground. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. We were both thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. I took the phone from his hand and walked a few more steps toward where the smell was coming from. About 12 feet from the edge of the gravel, half hidden in the tall grass, I found a pair of gloves. They were the disposable kind, latex or nitrile, the type you see doctors wearing. One of them was inside out, like someone had ripped it off in a hurry. I crouched down to get a better look, and that was when I saw the jacket. It was maybe 6 feet further into the grass, bunched up like someone had thrown it there. Dark colored, looked like denim or maybe canvas. I moved the flashlight beam across it, and my stomach turned. There was a stain on the back, a big one, dark and wet looking. I have never seen that much blood on anything in my life. Not even in movies where they exaggerate everything. This was real. The fabric was soaked through in some places, and there were smears leading away from it, deeper into the brush. Drag marks. Someone had been dragged from this spot into the woods. I stood up so fast I almost lost my balance. Tyler was right behind me, looking over my shoulder, and I heard him whisper something under his breath. A curse, a prayer, I don't know. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to come up with some innocent explanation that would make all of this okay. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe hunters had been here and dressed a deer or something. But hunters don't wear latex gloves. Hunters don't leave behind jackets soaked in blood. And those drag marks were wide, too wide to be an animal. The grass flattened in a path that was clearly made by something human-sized being pulled through it. I turned the flashlight off and grabbed Tyler by the arm. "We need to leave," I told him. "Right now." He didn't argue. We both started walking back toward the car, trying not to run, trying not to make noise. Every sound seemed amplified in that darkness. Our footsteps on the gravel, our breathing, the rustle of wind through the trees. I kept expecting to hear something else. Footsteps that weren't ours. A voice, something. We were maybe 20 feet from the car when Tyler stopped walking. He grabbed my shoulder and squeezed hard, not saying anything, just pointing. I followed his finger toward the tree line on the opposite side of the rest area, the side we hadn't explored. There was a light, faint, yellowish, barely visible through the branches. It looked like a flashlight beam, but it wasn't moving, just sitting there pointed in our direction. I couldn't tell how far away it was. 60 feet, maybe 110. The trees made it impossible to judge distance. We stood there frozen, staring at that light, waiting to see if it would move. It didn't, but then it turned off. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, and the darkness that replaced it felt heavier somehow. Tyler and I looked at each other. I could see the fear on his face, even in the dim glow from our headlights. Without a word, we both broke into a run toward the car. I got to the passenger side and yanked the door open while Tyler fumbled with his keys. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely get my seatbelt on. Tyler dropped the keys once, picked them up, dropped them again. I wanted to scream at him to hurry, but I couldn't find my voice. Finally, he got the key in the ignition, and the engine turned over. He threw the car into reverse, and we shot backward, gravel spraying everywhere, the tires spinning for a second before they caught. I twisted around in my seat to look out the back window, and that was when I saw the figure. A person just standing there at the edge of the tree and where that light had been. I couldn't make out any features, just a shape, dark against darker, watching us leave. Tyler must have seen it too in the rear-view mirror, because he said something I will not repeat and floored the gas pedal. We hit the highway going way too fast, the back end of the car fishtailing before he got it under control. Neither of us looked back again. We drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. I kept checking the side mirror, expecting to see headlights behind us, expecting someone to be following. The road was empty, just us and the dotted yellow line and the black wall of trees on either side. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Tyler's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but every time I opened my mouth, nothing came out. What do you even say after something like that? We just found evidence of what looked like a murder or an assault or something terrible. And there was someone in those woods who saw us find it. Someone who watched us discover what they did. I kept thinking about that light turning off. Whoever was holding it made a choice in that moment. They could have stayed hidden, waited for us to leave, but they wanted us to know they were there. They wanted us to see them watching. About 28 miles down the highway, we found a gas station that was still open. One of those 24-hour places with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a bored-looking guy behind the counter. We pulled in and just sat there for a minute. Engine running, neither of us wanting to get out. Tyler finally turned to me and asked what we should do. "Call the police," I said. Obviously, we have to call the police. But even as I said it, I felt this knot forming in my gut. What were we going to tell them? We found some gloves and a bloody jacket at an unmarked rest stop somewhere on the highway. We didn't even know exactly where we had been. There were no signs, no mile markers that I remembered. Nothing to identify that turnoff. I pulled up maps on my phone and tried to scroll back along the route we had taken, but every stretch of that highway looked the same. Trees, road, trees, road. Tyler suggested we just keep driving, get to St. Louis, forget about it. I told him we couldn't do that. If someone was hurt back there, if someone was dying in those woods while we sat here debating, we had to do something. I called 911 from the gas station parking lot. The dispatcher sounded tired, like she had already dealt with 100 calls that night, and mine was just one more. I tried to explain what we had found. The tire marks, the smell, the gloves, the jacket with blood on it, the drag marks. She asked me for a location, and I told her I didn't know exactly. Somewhere between mile marker 90 and 130 on the highway heading east from Fort Collins. That was the best I could do. She asked if we had touched anything, and I said no, which was true. She asked if we had seen anyone, and I hesitated. I told her about the light in the trees, about the figure standing there. When we drove away, there was a pause on the line. She asked me to describe the figure, and I said I couldn't. It was too dark. I just saw a shape. She told me to stay on the line while she contacted the state patrol. Tyler and I sat there in that parking lot for almost an hour, waiting for someone to call us back. When they finally did, it was a trooper who said they were sending units to check the area, but that it might take a while to locate the exact spot. We made it to St. Louis around noon the next day. I spent 2 days at the hospital with my dad, barely sleeping, jumping at every noise. Tyler stayed with his cousin in the city, and we texted back and forth, but didn't really talk about what happened. It was like we had made some unspoken agreement to pretend it was just a bad dream. On the 3rd day, I got a call from a detective with the state patrol. He said they had found the rest area we described. He said they had found evidence of what he called a violent incident. He wouldn't give me details over the phone, just asked if I would be willing to come in and give a formal statement when I got back to Fort Collins. I said yes. When I asked him if they found anybody in the woods, he went quiet for a second. Then he said they were still investigating and couldn't comment on an active case. The way he said it, the weight in his voice told me everything I needed to know. They found something in those trees or someone, and I don't think whoever it was made it out alive. I gave my statement 9 days later. The detective showed me photos of the rest area in daylight, and it looked so ordinary, so harmless, just a patch of gravel and grass next to the highway. He confirmed that they had recovered the jacket and gloves, that the blood was human, that they had found other evidence deeper in the woods that he couldn't discuss. He asked me again about the figure I saw, and I told him the same thing I told the dispatcher, just a shape, too dark to see anything else. He nodded like he expected that answer. When I asked if they had any suspects, he shook his head. No witnesses except us, and we hadn't seen enough to help. That was 8 months ago. I still check the news sometimes looking for any update, any arrest, anything. There has been nothing. Whoever was in those woods that night is still out there. Sometimes when I am driving at night and I see a dark turnoff on the side of the road, I feel my chest tighten and I grip the steering wheel a little harder. I think about that light turning off. I think about that figure standing there watching us leave, knowing we had seen what they did. And I wonder if they ever think about us too. Story 5. 5 of us crammed into my buddy Ethan's old Chevy Suburban that Saturday night in May 2025, heading from Houston to New Orleans for a bachelor party weekend. My friend Jonah was getting married in 3 months, and we had rented a house in the French Quarter, pulled our money for the trip, and taken the day off work. I had just turned 27 the week before, still working as a paralegal at a small firm downtown. And this trip felt like the kind of escape I desperately needed after months of grinding through case files. Ethan drove first shift. Jonah rode shotgun, handling the playlist, and the rest of us, me, Caleb, and Nate, spread out in the back 2 rows with a cooler of sodas and enough snacks to survive an apocalypse. We left around 7:35 in the evening, figuring we would drive through the night and arrive by early morning. The energy in the car was electric. 5 guys in their mid-20s acting like teenagers again, laughing about old college stories and roasting Jonah about finally settling down. We had been on the road for maybe 3.5 hours when we crossed into Louisiana, somewhere past the Texas border on a stretch of Interstate 10 that felt increasingly desolate. The billboards disappeared, replaced by dense walls of black trees pressing close to the highway. Traffic thinned out until we were often the only headlights visible in either direction. Ethan had the cruise control set at 70, keeping us just above the speed limit, but nothing crazy. Caleb had fallen asleep against the window, and Nate was scrolling through his phone with the brightness turned way down. Jonah and I were debating whether to stop for gas at the next exit or push through another hour when Ethan suddenly sat up straighter and squinted into the rear view mirror. Red and blue lights had appeared behind us, flickering through the back window with an intensity that made me instinctively reach for my seat belt to check if it was fastened. Ethan muttered something under his breath and started slowing down, pulling toward the shoulder as the vehicle behind us followed, its lights painting the dark trees in alternating splashes of color. The first thing I noticed when we came to a complete stop was the vehicle itself. It was a dark, cold SUV, maybe black or deep navy, but it had no clear markings on the side. No sheriff's star, no state trooper emblem, no police written anywhere that I could see. The light bar on top looked almost homemade, like someone had mounted it themselves, and it sat slightly crooked on the roof. Caleb woke up and asked what was going on, his voice groggy and confused. Nate leaned forward between the front seats, trying to get a better look. We all just sat there in silence for what felt like forever, watching the figure inside the SUV through our mirrors. The driver's door finally opened, and a man stepped out, but he didn't walk the way cops usually walk during a traffic stop. He moved too quickly, almost eagerly, and he approached the driver's side window without that cautious hand-on-hip posture you see in every police procedural on television. He was carrying a flashlight, but he kept it pointed down at the ground instead of into our vehicle. Ethan rolled down his window about halfway, and the man leaned in closer than any officer had ever gotten during the few traffic stops I had witnessed in my life. He was wearing dark clothing, something that looked like a uniform, but not quite right. The shirt was plain black with no badge, no name tag, no department patches. He had a belt with various items attached, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out what they were. His face was gaunt with deep-set eyes that caught the red glow from his own tail lights, and he had a patchy beard that looked like it had been growing unchecked for weeks. The man smiled at Ethan, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that made you want to look away. He asked for license and registration in a voice that was too casual, too friendly, like he was greeting an old neighbor instead of conducting an official stop. Ethan handed over his documents, and the man took them without even glancing at them, just held them loosely in his hand while he scanned the inside of our vehicle with those hollow eyes. He started asking questions, but none of them had anything to do with why he had pulled us over. He wanted to know where we were headed, which I guess was normal enough. But then he asked how long we planned to stay. He asked if anyone was expecting us, if we had told our families about the trip, if anyone knew exactly which route we were taking. Jonah shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat and said, We were just going to New Orleans for a weekend trip, trying to keep it vague. The man nodded slowly, like he was cataloging every word. Then he pointed his flashlight directly at Nate in the back seat and asked him specifically if he had a girlfriend waiting for him at home. Nate stammered out a confused yes, and the man asked if she knew where he was right now, if she would entice if he didn't text her tonight. The question hung in the air like something rotten. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and I exchanged a look with Caleb that confirmed we were both thinking the same thing. Something was very wrong here. Ethan finally asked what this was about, what he had been pulled over for, and the man just chuckled and said he would get to that. The man stepped back from the window and walked slowly around the front of the Suburban, dragging his fingers along the hood as he went, like he was inspecting it for dust. He stopped at the passenger side and tapped on the window with one knuckle, signaling for Jonah to roll it down. Jonah hesitated, looking at Ethan, who gave a small nod because what else could we do? The guy had lights. He had pulled us over. We were stuck on the side of a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, Louisiana. Jonah cracked the window just a few inches, and the man bent down to peer inside, his face uncomfortably close to the glass. He asked Jonah to step out of the vehicle. Just like that, casual as anything, like he was asking him to pass the salt. He said he needed to speak with him privately, that it was standard procedure, that it would only take a minute. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Jonah asked why, asked what he had done, and the man's expression flickered. Just for a second, something cold and irritated passed across his face before the fake friendliness returned. He repeated that he needed Jonah to step out. And this time, his voice had an edge to it. That was the moment Ethan did something that probably saved us. He pulled out his phone and said he was going to call 911 just to verify the stop. Said he had heard about fake police incidents and wanted to make sure everything was legitimate. He said it calmly, almost apologetically, like he was embarrassed to be cautious. The man outside straightened up fast, and I watched his whole demeanor change in an instant. The fake smile vanished completely. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back from the vehicle, his eyes darting toward his SUV parked behind us. He told Ethan that wouldn't be necessary, that he was wasting everyone's time, that we were free to go. Just like that. No ticket, no warning, no explanation for why he had pulled us over in the first place. He didn't even hand back Ethan's license and registration. He just dropped them on the ground next to the driver's side door and started walking back to his vehicle. His pace was quick now, urgent, completely different from the slow, predatory approach he had used when he first got out. Caleb whispered for Ethan to go, to just drive, and Ethan didn't need to be told twice. Ethan threw the Suburban into drive and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating faster than I had ever seen him drive. Nobody said anything for at least a full minute. We just sat there in the glow of the dashboard lights, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Nate was the first to speak, asking if that guy was even a real cop, and none of us had an answer. I turned around in my seat to watch the SUV behind us, half expecting it to follow. But its lights suddenly went dark. The red and blue stopped flashing. The headlights turned off completely, and the vehicle just sat there on the shoulder like a dead thing. Then it made a U-turn across the median, which no police officer would ever do, and disappeared in the opposite direction, without any lights on at all. We watched until it vanished into the darkness. And then we all started talking at once, our voices overlapping with fear and confusion and adrenaline. Jonah kept saying he had almost gotten out of the car, that he had actually reached for the door handle before the man's questions got too strange. That thought made me feel sick in a way I can't fully describe. We drove for another 40 minutes without stopping, checking the mirrors constantly, jumping at every pair of headlights that appeared behind us. Ethan kept his speed exactly at the limit, terrified of getting pulled over again, but also terrified of staying in that stretch of highway any longer than necessary. When we finally saw a well-lit gas station near the next exit, we pulled in without even discussing it. The fluorescent lights felt like a sanctuary after all that darkness. We parked close to the entrance where other cars were filling up, where there were cameras and people, and the ordinary sounds of a convenience store operating in the middle of the night. I got out on shaky legs and just stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of gasoline and fried food from inside, grounding myself in something normal. That was the moment we noticed a Louisiana State Trooper vehicle parked on the other side of the lot, a real one with proper markings, and a uniformed officer sitting inside doing paperwork. Caleb suggested we go talk to him, tell him what happened, and after a brief debate, we all agreed. We needed to know if what we had experienced was as wrong as it felt. The trooper's name was printed on a tag pinned to his chest, and he looked up from his clipboard with the kind of tired patience that comes from working night shifts for years. We must have looked rattled because he immediately asked if we were all right, if there had been an accident. Ethan explained what happened. The SUV with no markings, the crooked light bar, the man in plain black clothes asking invasive questions, the attempt to separate Jonah from the group. The trooper's expression changed as Ethan talked. He went from politely attentive to genuinely concerned, leaning forward in his seat and asking us to describe the vehicle again, to describe the man, to pinpoint exactly where on the interstate this had occurred. When Ethan finished, the trooper was quiet for a moment. Then he told us something that made my stomach turn to ice. He said there was no authorized unit operating in that area tonight. No sheriff's deputies, no state troopers, no federal vehicles. He said we needed to file an official report immediately. And his voice had a gravity to it that told me this wasn't the first time he had heard a story like ours. We spent the next 2 hours at a state police station off the highway giving statements and descriptions to a detective who recorded everything on a digital device. She asked us to recall every detail we could. The shape of the light bar, the exact wording of the questions, the way the man had moved, anything distinctive about his appearance or his vehicle. Nate remembered that the SUV had a small dent on the front bumper, driver's side. Caleb recalled that the man had been wearing boots that looked military, not the polished shoes a real officer would wear. I remembered his hands, how his fingernails were long and dirty, how he had a faded tattoo on his left wrist that looked like numbers or letters, but I couldn't make it out in the dark. The detective wrote everything down without expression, but when we finished, she thanked us in a way that felt heavy, significant. She said, "Our description matched 2 other reports from the past 18 months, incidents on the same stretch of highway involving a similar vehicle and a man fitting the same general appearance." She didn't tell us what happened in those other cases, and I didn't ask. I was too afraid of the answer. We made it to New Orleans just after sunrise, but the bachelor party felt hollow after that. We went through the motions, the dinners, the bars, the laughter that came too loud and faded too quickly. But none of us could shake what had happened on that dark stretch of Interstate 10. Jonah kept coming back to the moment he almost opened the door, kept saying he could feel the handle under his fingers, kept wondering what would have happened if he had stepped out into the night with that man. We never found out who he was. The detective called Ethan about a month later to say they were still investigating, that they had increased patrols in that area, but no arrest was ever made as far as I know. Sometimes I search online for news stories about that highway, about missing persons or attacks on travelers in rural Louisiana, and I find enough to keep me awake at night. I think about how easily we could have become one of those stories. I think about how the only thing that saved us was Ethan's instinct to reach for his phone. And I think about that man still out there somewhere, waiting on a dark shoulder with his crooked lights flashing, hoping the next group of travelers will be a little less cautious than we were. Story 6. Mara had been asleep for the last hour when everything changed. We were driving from Seattle down to Fresno for her cousin's wedding, a long haul we had decided to tackle in one shot to save money on a motel. She and I graduated together from Washington State in 2016, got married 3 years later, and between her nursing shifts and my work as an electrician, we rarely found time for road trips anymore. That Friday morning, we left before sunrise, loaded the Toyota Highlander with snacks and luggage, and watched the Pacific Northwest fade into California's golden hills. October had brought that perfect kind of weather where the sun warms everything without making you sweat. and I drove with the window cracked open, listening to a true crime podcast while Mara napped with her head against the glass. We had planned everything down to the rest stops, charging cables, and a cooler full of sandwiches. For the first 6 hours, the trip felt almost peaceful, like a small vacation before the chaos of wedding festivities. We were somewhere past Reading, deep into that desolate corridor where gas stations become rare, and the landscape turns to dry brush and brown hills, when I noticed the man on the shoulder. A silver pickup truck sat with its hood propped open, and beside it stood a figure waving his arms slowly, almost tiredly, like someone who had been at it for a while. I eased off the gas and Mara stirred awake, squinting through the windshield at the scene ahead. He looked ordinary enough: jeans, a flannel shirt with rolled sleeves, a faded baseball cap pulled low over graying stubble, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face you see on guys who work outdoors. His truck had California plates, and a gym bag sat at his feet. Mara gave me a questioning glance, that silent conversation married couples have, and I pulled over about 50 foot past him. Broad daylight, cell service on my phone, and the guy seemed genuinely stuck. When I rolled down my window, he approached with a relieved expression and explained his fuel pump had failed, leaving him stranded for nearly 2 hours with nobody stopping to help. His name was Dean, or at least that is what he told us. He said he was heading to Modesto to visit his daughter, that he had been driving since morning, and the truck just died on him without warning. The way he spoke seemed calm, polite even, with a slight southern drawl that made him sound friendly. He asked if we could give him a ride to the next town with a mechanic, maybe 25 or 30 miles down the road. Mara looked at me, and I could see her doing the mental math. Daylight, public highway, 2 of us versus 1 of him. I told Dean to grab his bag and hop in the back seat. He thanked us repeatedly, almost too much, and settled in behind Mara with his gym bag on his lap. As I pulled back onto the interstate, I caught a glimpse of him in the rear-view mirror, adjusting his cap and looking out the window. Nothing alarming, nothing strange, just a guy who got unlucky with car trouble, or so I convinced myself in that moment. The first 17 minutes passed without incident. Dean made small talk about the weather, asked where we were headed, and mentioned he used to work construction before his back gave out. Mara, always the friendly one, engaged him with questions about his daughter, and he answered with the kind of vague details that seemed normal at the time. She was in college studying something with computers, lived with her boyfriend in an apartment near downtown. He spoke slowly, deliberately, and I noticed he kept glancing at my phone mounted on the dashboard, watching the GPS map as it tracked our route south. At some point, he asked how far we were from the next exit, and when I said about 14 miles, he nodded and went quiet. Mara shot me a look through the corner of her eye, the kind that said she was paying attention too. The silence in the car grew heavier, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why things shifted when we approached the exit for a small town called Red Bluff. I signaled to take the off-ramp, figuring this would be a good place to drop Dean off and let him find a mechanic or call a tow truck. But before I could merge into the exit lane, his voice came from the back seat, sharper than before. "Keep going straight," he said. "This town is no good. Nothing open on Thursdays." I glanced at Mara, who had turned slightly in her seat to look at him. I told Dean this was the exit he had asked for, the next town with services, but he shook his head and insisted we continue to the one after. Something about a friend who worked at a garage there, someone who would give him a deal. His tone had changed, the friendly drawl replaced by something flatter, more insistent. I missed the exit, merging back into the flow of traffic, and watched in the mirror as Dean settled back into his seat with his hands resting on the gym bag. Mara reached over and squeezed my knee, a silent message that I understood completely. The next 18 minutes felt like hours. Dean started giving directions unprompted, telling me which lane to stay in, pointing out upcoming signs as if I couldn't read them myself. When I mentioned that the GPS showed a rest stop ahead with gas stations and food, he dismissed it immediately, saying those places were overpriced tourist traps and we should keep moving. His voice carried an edge now, not quite threatening, but firm in a way that left no room for discussion. Mara tried to ease the tension by offering him a bottle of water from our cooler, but he declined without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I noticed his right hand had slipped inside the gym bag, resting there casually, and my mind started racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, with a stranger in our back seat who no longer seemed interested in being dropped off anywhere. I decided to test him. I announced that we needed gas, that the tank was getting low, and I would have to stop at the next station regardless of his opinion on tourist traps. Dean leaned forward between the seats, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes, and looked at the fuel gauge on the dashboard. "You got enough to make it another 35 miles, he said, his voice low and steady. "Trust me, there is a better spot up ahead. Cleaner bathrooms, cheaper gas. You will thank me." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. Mara had gone rigid in her seat, her hand still on my knee but gripping harder now. I kept driving, my mind working through options that all seemed to end badly. If I pulled over and demanded he get out, what would he do? What was in that bag? The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless. No other cars in sight, just brown hills and dead grass under a sky that suddenly looked too big and too indifferent. I thought about my phone, about calling 911, but Dean was right there watching everything, and I couldn't risk making him feel cornered. He started talking about his life unprompted in a way that felt like a warning wrapped in conversation. He mentioned he had done time casually, like he was discussing the weather. Said he had made mistakes when he was younger. Got mixed up with the wrong people. Spent a few years in a facility up north. "People judge you for your past," he said, staring at the back of Mara's head. "They see a record, and they think they know who you are. But sometimes a man just needs a break. You know, sometimes he just needs people to help him get where he is going without asking too many questions." Mara nodded slowly, not turning around, and I could see her chest rising and falling faster than normal. I mumbled something agreeable, playing along, buying time. Dean smiled at that, a brief flash of teeth in the rearview mirror, and patted the gym bag on his lap like it was a pet. "You two seem like good people," he continued. "Smart people, the kind who understand that some situations are better handled quietly." I felt sweat forming on my palms despite the air conditioning blowing cold, and I realized with horrible clarity that we were completely at his mercy. We had been driving for another 17 minutes when I spotted something ahead that changed everything. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance. A cluster of patrol cars parked along the shoulder with officers standing outside, setting up what looked like a checkpoint. My heart jumped and I saw Mara sit up straighter, hope flashing across her face for the first real time in an hour. But Dean saw it too. He cursed under his breath and leaned forward again, his hand now fully inside the gym bag, gripping something I couldn't see. "Take the next exit," he hissed, his voice completely different now, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Do it now before we get any closer." I looked at the GPS and saw an exit approaching in 3/4 of a mile. A rural route that led into empty farmland with no towns marked for miles. My hands trembled on the wheel as I weighed my choices. If I took the exit, we would be alone with him on a deserted road with no witnesses. If I kept driving toward the checkpoint, I had no idea what he would do, what he would pull from that bag in desperation. Mara made the decision for me. She pointed at the dashboard and said loud enough for Dean to hear that the engine temperature was spiking, and we needed to pull over immediately or risk blowing the radiator. It was a lie. The gauge was fine, but she sold it with convincing panic in her voice. I understood instantly what she was doing. I flicked on the hazard lights and started slowing down, pulling toward the shoulder about a 1/4 mile before the checkpoint. Close enough that the officers could see us, but far enough that Dean might feel he had a chance to run. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. I told him the car was overheating, that I had no choice, that we would be stuck on the highway if I didn't stop. He looked at the police lights ahead, then at the open fields beside us, calculating his options. For a long, terrible moment, I thought he was going to do something violent. I could feel it in the air, that electricity before a storm breaks. Mara was pressed against her door, ready to jump out the second the car stopped, and I had already decided I would throw myself at him if he made any move toward her. The car rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder, and for 3 seconds nobody moved. Dean stared at the police lights, then back at us, then at the open field stretching toward a line of trees maybe 200 yards away. I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to look as non-threatening as possible, giving him no reason to escalate. "Stay in the car," he said quietly, almost to himself. And then he grabbed his gym bag and opened the rear door. He didn't run at first. He walked quickly but deliberately, heading away from the highway toward the tree-in without looking back. Mara grabbed my arm, and we both stayed frozen, watching him go. Neither of us willing to move until he was far enough away. When he reached the edge of the field, maybe 50 yards out, he finally broke into a jog and disappeared into the brush. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Mara was shaking beside me, her face pale, and I pulled her into an awkward hug across the center console. We sat there for a minute, just breathing, just being alive and together and safe. One of the officers from the checkpoint approached our car a few minutes later. A tall woman with a calm demeanor who asked if we were having car trouble. I told her the truth that we had picked up a hitchhiker who had grown threatening and had just fled into the field. Her expression changed immediately, and she radioed to her colleagues while asking us for a description. We told her everything we could remember. The flannel shirt, the baseball cap, the gym bag, the silver pickup truck with California plates abandoned back near Redding. She listened carefully, taking notes, and then told us something that made my entire body go cold. They were looking for someone matching that description in connection with an armed robbery 3 counties north, a gas station holdup where the clerk had been badly beaten. The man had carjacked a truck to escape and had been last seen heading south on this very highway. We had been driving for over an hour with someone capable of real violence sitting 3 foot behind my wife. The officer took our contact information and told us we might be called as witnesses. Then let us continue on our way. Mara and I didn't speak for the next 55 miles. We just held hands across the console, the radio off. The only sound, the hum of the engine carrying us toward Fresno and away from the worst day of our lives. Story 7. Evelyn and I had been married for 39 years. When we finally decided to take that cross-country trip, we kept postponing since our youngest graduated college back in 2010. I had retired from the county records office 2 years prior, and she had just finished her last semester teaching 5th grade at Oak Hollow Elementary. Our granddaughter Maya was turning 5 in Arizona, and our son Daniel kept insisting we make the drive out instead of flying. He wanted us to experience the open road, see the landscapes we had only talked about over dinner for decades. So we bought a used camper, a 2015 Fleetwood Storm that still had good bones despite the faded exterior. We spent 26 days getting it road ready, checking every seal, every hose, every belt. Evelyn picked out new curtains, pale blue with little white flowers, and I installed a better radio system, so we could listen to her audiobooks during the long stretches. We mapped our route carefully, planning stops at national parks and small diners that had good reviews online. We left Bloomfield, Iowa on a Monday morning in early October, the kind of day where the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Evelyn made egg sandwiches wrapped in foil for breakfast, and I filled 2 thermoses with black coffee. Our neighbors, Roger and June Walsh, waved from their porch as we pulled out of the driveway, the camper groaning slightly under the weight of everything we had packed. Behind us, we towed our old Honda Element, figuring we would need a smaller vehicle once we arrived at Daniel's place for day trips and grocery runs. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. We stopped at a campground near Lincoln the first night, grilled burgers on our little portable stove, and watched the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Evelyn fell asleep reading her mystery novel, while I stayed up listening to the crickets and feeling genuinely happy for the first real time in months. I can remember thinking that this was exactly what retirement was supposed to feel like. I had no idea that within 3 days, everything would shatter into something I still can't fully explain. By the third day, we had crossed into Wyoming and were making our way through some of the most isolated stretches of highway I had ever seen. The landscape shifted from flat farmland to rugged hills dotted with scrub brush and red rock formations. Cell service became spotty around noon, and by 2:30 in the afternoon, we had no signal at all. Evelyn kept checking her phone, wanting to send pictures to Daniel, but eventually she gave up and just started taking photos to send later. We stopped for gas at a small station outside a town called Dry Creek, population maybe 300, according to the faded sign. The station was one of those old-fashioned places with just 2 pumps and a little convenience store attached. A man came out to help us, which surprised me since I hadn't seen full-service gas in years. He was tall and wiry, maybe in his 50s, with deep lines carved into his face from sun exposure and a faded denim jacket despite the warmth. His name tag said Cal, and he smiled at us in a way that seemed friendly enough, though his eyes lingered on our camper and the Honda behind it a little too long. Cal asked where we were headed, and I told him Arizona to see family. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that looked like it had never been clean. He mentioned that the route we were taking, Highway 62 through the Canyon Pass, had been having some trouble lately. When I asked what kind of trouble, he just shrugged and said folks had been reporting car problems out there, breakdowns in spots where tow trucks took hours to arrive. He suggested we take the longer route through Pine Haven instead, adding maybe 2 hours to our trip, but keeping us on busier roads. Evelyn and I exchanged a look. We had planned this route specifically because of the scenic views through the canyon, and 2 extra hours meant arriving at Daniel's place well after dark. I thanked Cal for the advice, but told him we would stick to our original plan. He didn't argue, just handed me my receipt and said to be careful out there. As we pulled away, I saw him in my side mirror, still standing by the pumps, watching us until we disappeared around the bend. Evelyn mentioned that he seemed nice, just a little odd. I agreed, though something about the encounter sat uneasy in my chest, a feeling I pushed aside because I didn't want to ruin the mood of our trip. Highway 62 wound through the canyon like a gray ribbon draped over ancient bones. The rock walls rose on either side of us, striped with layers of orange and brown and deep purple where the shadows pulled. Evelyn had her window down, snapping pictures every few minutes, marveling at formations that looked like castles or sleeping giants depending on how the light hit them. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as we navigated the curves. We hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The camper handled well enough, but towing the Honda made everything feel heavier, more sluggish. Around 4:20 in the afternoon, I noticed a gray pickup truck appear in my rear-view mirror. It stayed far back at first, just a speck against the canyon walls, but over the next 20 minutes, it gradually closed the distance until it was maybe 50 yards behind us. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the glare on their windshield, just a dark shape behind the wheel. Evelyn noticed me checking the mirror and turned around to look. She said it was probably just someone else heading through the canyon, nothing to worry about. I nodded, but I kept watching. The pickup stayed behind us for another 35 minutes, never passing even when the road widened enough to allow it. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up slightly, it matched my pace exactly. Evelyn stopped taking pictures and started watching the truck, too, her earlier cheerfulness fading into something more guarded. I suggested we pull over at the next scenic overlook and let them pass just to ease my mind. She agreed quietly. About 12 minutes later, we reached a small gravel pull-out with a wooden sign marking it as Redstone Viewpoint. I eased the camper off the road and came to a stop, expecting the gray pickup to cruise past us and disappear around the next bend. Instead, it slowed down as it approached, almost to a crawl, and I got my first clear look at the driver. He was a younger man, maybe mid-30s, with a shaved head and a thick beard that covered most of his face. He wore dark sunglasses, even though the sun was already dipping behind the canyon walls. He stared directly at us as he passed, his head turning to follow our position, and I saw his lips move like he was saying something or maybe counting. Then he accelerated and vanished around the curve ahead. Evelyn grabbed my arm and asked if I saw that. If I saw the way he looked at us. I told her, yes, I saw it. We sat there in silence for several seconds, the engine idling, the wind whistling through the canyon like a low moan. I wanted to turn around. I told Evelyn we should head back to Dry Creek, find a place to stay for the night, and take the alternate route in the morning. But she pointed out that we had already driven over an hour into the canyon, and going back would mean losing most of the daylight we had left. The map showed a small town called Merrow about 45 minutes ahead, and she suggested we push through, get to Merrow, and stop there instead. It made sense logically, and I told myself the man in the pickup was probably just some local who was curious about out-of-state plates. People in isolated areas notice strangers. It didn't have to mean anything sinister. So I put the camper back in drive and pulled onto the highway, checking my mirrors, constantly scanning the road ahead for any sign of that white truck. For the next 20 minutes, the drive was uneventful. The canyon walls began to shrink as we climbed higher, and patches of pine forest started appearing on the slopes. Evelyn relaxed a little, commenting on how pretty the trees looked in the golden afternoon light. I let myself breathe again. Maybe we had overreacted. Maybe the guy was just odd. Nothing more. Then we came around a sharp bend, and I had to slam the brakes so hard that Evelyn lurched forward against her seat belt, and our coffee thermos flew off the dashboard onto the floor. The gray pickup was parked sideways across the road, blocking both lanes completely. The driver was standing in front of it, arms crossed over his chest, watching us approach. He had taken off his sunglasses, and even from 50 feet away, I could see his eyes were pale, almost colorless, like dirty ice. Behind him, two other men emerged from the tree-in on the right side of the road. One was short and stocky, wearing a camouflage jacket, and carrying something in his right hand that I couldn't identify at first. The other was taller, thinner, with long, greasy hair pulled back in a ponytail and a cigarette hanging from his lip. They walked slowly toward the pickup, flanking the bald man, and all three of them stared at our camper with expressions that held no friendliness, no curiosity, only a kind of flat anticipation. Evelyn whispered my name, her voice tight and thin. I threw the camper into reverse, my foot already pressing the gas pedal. But before I could move more than a few feet, I heard the sound of another engine behind us. I looked in my side mirror and saw a rusted green sedan pulling up to block our retreat, stopping about 20 yards back. A fourth man stepped out, older than the others, with gray stubble and a hunting rifle resting casually against his shoulder. We were boxed in completely, trapped in a stretch of canyon road with rock walls on one side, thick forest on the other, and men who clearly had been waiting for us to arrive. Evelyn begged me to do something, anything, but my mind went blank with a kind of terror I had never experienced before. 39 years of marriage, 2 kids raised, a whole life built on routine and predictability, and none of it had prepared me for this moment. The bald man started walking toward us, his boots crunching on the gravel, and he motioned for me to roll down my window. I didn't move. He stopped about 10 feet from my door and tilted his head like he was studying an animal in a cage. Then he spoke, his voice calm and almost friendly, telling me that we could do this the easy way or the hard way, and that the easy way meant stepping out of the vehicle with our hands visible and cooperating. He said they weren't going to hurt us if we behaved, that they just wanted the camper and whatever cash we had, and then they would let us walk to Merrow on foot. I wanted to believe him. Part of me was desperate to believe that this was just a robbery, that we would lose our belongings but keep our lives. But I looked at the other men, at their faces, at the way the stocky one kept tapping whatever was in his hand against his thigh. And I knew in my gut that they had no intention of letting us walk anywhere. Evelyn knew it too. She reached over and squeezed my hand, so hard I felt her rings dig into my skin. I made a decision in that moment that still haunts me. I told Evelyn to hold on, and then I floored the gas pedal in reverse, aiming straight for the green sedan behind us. The older man dove out of the way, dropping his rifle, and I heard the sickening crunch of metal as the Honda we were towing slammed into the sedan's front end. The impact jolted us hard, and I heard glass shatter somewhere behind me, but the sedan spun sideways just enough to create a gap on the left side of the road. I threw the camper into drive and cranked the wheel, tires screaming against the asphalt as I tried to squeeze through. The bald man lunged at my window, his fist connecting with the glass and leaving a spiderweb crack across my line of sight. The stocky one ran alongside us, and I finally saw what he was carrying, a crowbar, which he swung at the camper's side panel with a sound like a thunderclap. But we were moving, gaining speed, and I kept my foot pressed to the floor even as the camper rocked and shuddered from the damage. In my mirror, I saw the men scrambling back to their vehicles, and I knew we had only bought ourselves minutes at most. Evelyn was crying, asking if I was okay, asking what we were going to do, and I had no answers for her. All I could do was drive. The camper was struggling. Whatever damage the collision had caused, I could feel it in the way the steering pulled hard to the right, and the engine made a grinding noise that hadn't been there before. The Honda behind us was dragging badly, one of its front tires blown out and scraping against the pavement in a shower of sparks. I knew we couldn't keep going like this for long. Evelyn checked her phone again, praying for a signal, but there wasn't anything. The road climbed higher, twisting through dense pine forest now, the canyon walls long behind us. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see headlights, but the road behind us stayed dark. Maybe we had disabled their vehicles enough to slow them down. Maybe they had given up. I didn't believe either possibility, but I let myself hope. About 15 minutes later, the camper started shuddering violently, and a horrible burning smell filled the cab. Evelyn pointed at the temperature gauge, which had climbed all the way into the red. The radiator must have been damaged in the collision. I had no choice but to pull over before the engine seized completely. I found a dirt road that branched off the highway, partially hidden by overgrown brush. And I turned onto it, driving about a 4 mile until we were out of sight from the main road. Then I killed the engine, and we sat there in the sudden silence, listening to the ticking of hot metal and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I told Evelyn we needed to abandon the camper on foot in the dark. We might have a chance of hiding until morning, and then we could find our way to Marrow or flag down a passing car. She didn't argue. We grabbed what we could carry quickly: water bottles, a flashlight, her phone, even though it was useless, my wallet with our cash and cards. I thought about the Honda, but one look at its mangled front end told me it wasn't going anywhere. As we climbed out of the camper, the forest around us felt enormous and alive, every rustle of leaves making my heart pound. We started walking deeper into the woods, away from the dirt road, trying to move quietly through the underbrush. Evelyn held my hand so tight I could feel her pulse racing against my palm. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, stumbling over roots and rocks in the fading light, until we found a small ravine with a rocky overhang that offered some concealment. We crawled underneath and pressed ourselves against the cold stone, barely breathing, waiting. The darkness came fast, swallowing the forest in shades of black and gray. And then from somewhere back toward the highway, I heard the sound of engines. More than one. They had found us, or at least found where we had turned off. Evelyn buried her face against my shoulder to muffle any sound, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her whole body tremble. Headlights flickered through the trees in the distance, sweeping back and forth like searchlights, and I heard men's voices calling out to each other, though I couldn't make out the words. We stayed under that overhang for hours. I don't know exactly how long, because time stopped making sense in the darkness. At some point, the voices faded and the headlights disappeared, but neither of us dared to move. Evelyn fell into a kind of fitful half-leap against my chest, whimpering softly every few minutes, and I stayed awake, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. My legs cramped. My back ached from pressing against the stone. Mosquitoes found us and bit every inch of exposed skin, but I didn't swat at them because even that small motion seemed too risky. Around what I guessed was 3 o'clock or 4 in the morning, I saw an orange glow rising above the tree line in the direction where we had left the camper. It flickered and grew brighter, and soon I could smell smoke drifting through the forest. They were burning it, destroying any evidence of what they had tried to do, or maybe just taking out their anger on our belongings since they couldn't find us. I held Evelyn tighter and watched the glow pulse against the sky until it finally began to fade with the first gray light of dawn. When the sun came up enough to see clearly, we crawled out from our hiding spot, stiff and exhausted and covered in dirt and bug bites. We started walking east toward where I thought the highway should be, moving slowly and stopping every few minutes to listen for any sounds of pursuit. It took us almost 4 hours to reach a paved road and another hour of walking along its shoulder before a truck driver spotted us and pulled over. His name was Victor Hale, and he was hauling lumber down to Tucson. He took one look at us, dirty and scratched up and clearly terrified, and told us to get in without asking any questions. He drove us straight to the sheriff's station in Merrill. And from there, everything became a blur of statements and interviews and phone calls to Daniel, who drove through the night to be with us. The police found our camper 3 days later, burned down to the frame in the spot where we had abandoned it. The Honda was discovered about 7 miles away, stripped of its plates and anything valuable, left on the side of a logging road. They arrested a man named Nolan Strake 26 days later, the bald one with the pale eyes, after he tried to pull the same scheme on another couple passing through. He had a record going back 18 years, armed robbery, assault, vehicle theft, and he was linked to at least 2 other disappearances in that region where the victims were never found. The other men scattered and were never identified, at least not that the police ever told us. Nolan never confessed to anything, never explained what they had planned to do with us if we had cooperated that day on the canyon road. I think about it sometimes late at night when Evelyn is asleep beside me and the house is quiet. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't slammed that gas pedal in reverse. If I had believed his lie about letting us walk to Merrill, we would be 2 more names on a list of people who vanished on a lonely stretch of highway, and our son would have spent the rest of his life wondering what happened to his parents. We never took another road trip after that. The Fleetwood was gone and neither of us had any desire to replace it. Some roads are not meant to be traveled, and some memories can't be left behind no matter how far you drive. Story 8. Trevor swore he could drive through anything, and we were all dumb enough to believe him. April 2024, spring break, and our little group had been on the road for almost 9 hours. Me riding shotgun, Trevor behind the wheel of his dad's old Suburban, his girlfriend Alina in the middle row, and Marco and Jenna crammed in the back with all our bags. We had graduated together the year before, class of 2023, and this San Antonio trip was supposed to be our big farewell before adult life pulled us apart. The plan seemed brilliant at the time. Drive through the night, skip the motel, save a $100. The weather had started getting ugly somewhere past the Texas-Arkansas border. But Trevor just turned up the radio, and Marco cracked open a bottle of whiskey he had smuggled from his older brother's cabinet. I took a drink when it came my way, felt the burn go down my throat, and laughed at something stupid. Jenna said, "We were young. We were together." And the storm outside felt like nothing more than background noise to our little adventure. The rain got heavier around 12:20. I was sitting in the front passenger seat, watching the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. The road we were on, some state highway I can't even remember the number of now, was pitch black except for our headlights. No street lamps, no other cars, just endless darkness on both sides. Trevor had been driving for almost 5 hours at that point, and I noticed his eyes were getting heavy. He kept rubbing his face and rolling down the window to let the cold air hit him. Alina suggested we pull over somewhere and rest for a few hours, but Trevor waved her off. Said we were only 3 hours out. That stopping now would be stupid when we were so close. Marco laughed from the back and made some joke about Trevor being a lightweight. And that was when Trevor grabbed the whiskey bottle and took a long drink just to prove a point. I should have said something. I should have grabbed the wheel or demanded we stop. But I just sat there watching the rain pound against the glass, telling myself we would be fine. Around 1:18 in the morning, Jenna fell asleep against the window in the back. Alina had dozed off too, her head resting on a bundled-up jacket. Marco was scrolling through his phone, the blue light making his face look ghostly in the darkness. I remember feeling my own eyelids getting heavy, that dangerous pull of sleep when you have been awake too long. The heater was blasting, the car was warm, and the sound of the rain had turned into this constant white noise that made everything feel dreamlike. I pinched my arm a few times to stay alert, kept checking on Trevor. He was blinking too much, that rapid flutter people do when they are fighting to stay conscious. I asked him if he wanted me to take over, told him I could drive the rest of the way. He shook his head, said he was fine, said we were almost there. The GPS showed 2 hours and 25 minutes remaining. I remember that number exactly because I stared at it wondering if we would actually make it. The curve came out of nowhere. 1 second we were on a straight stretch of highway, and the next the road bent sharply to the left. There was a yellow warning sign, I think, but the rain was coming down so hard that Trevor didn't see it until we were right on top of it. He yanked the wheel, overcorrected, and suddenly the Suburban was sliding sideways across the wet asphalt. I heard Alina scream from behind me, this piercing sound that cut through everything. The tires made a horrible squealing noise as Trevor tried to regain control, pumping the brakes the way you are not supposed to do on a slick road. Time stretched out in that weird way it does during a crisis. I could see every drop of rain frozen in the headlights, could feel my body pressing against the seat belt as we spun. Then we hit the guardrail on the right side of the road, and the impact threw me forward so hard I thought my chest would cave in. The car didn't stop at the guardrail. We went through it or over it, I still don't know which. All I remember is the sensation of falling, this sickening drop in my stomach as the Suburban left the road entirely. We rolled at least twice, maybe 3 times. Glass shattered everywhere. I heard Marco yelling something, heard metal crunching and twisting around us. My head slammed against the window, against the dashboard, against something hard that split my forehead open. Everything was spinning, tumbling, a chaos of sounds and pain and absolute terror. When the car finally stopped moving, we were upside down in a ditch. The engine still running, the headlights pointing at nothing but mud and broken branches. I was hanging from my seat belt, blood dripping from my face onto the ceiling below me. And for a few seconds, I couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The first thing I became aware of after the ringing faded was Alina crying. Not screaming anymore, just these broken, gasping sobs that sounded like she couldn't catch her breath. I called out to Trevor, but he didn't answer. His body was slumped forward, held in place by his seat belt, and his arms were dangling limp toward the crushed roof beneath us. I could see blood on his face, a lot of it, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely find my seat belt buckle. I kept pressing the button over and over, but it was jammed or bent or something. The rain was still pounding outside, coming in through the broken windows, mixing with the blood on my face. I finally got my belt undone and dropped hard onto the ceiling, landing on broken glass and pieces of plastic from the dashboard. The pain in my shoulder hit me then, this sharp burning sensation that made me want to throw up. I think I dislocated it in the crash, but I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that something was very wrong with my left arm. I crawled toward Trevor first because he was closest. The whole front of the car was caved in. The steering wheel pressed up against his chest in a way that made my heart seize up. I grabbed his face, slapped his cheek a few times, kept saying his name like that would somehow wake him up. His eyes were closed, and there was a deep gash running from his hairline down to his eyebrow. Blood pumping out in a steady rhythm that scared me more than anything. He was breathing though. I could see his chest rising and falling in shallow little movements. Behind me, I heard Marco groaning and Jenna calling out for help, her voice high and panicked. Alina had stopped crying and gone quiet, which was almost worse. I didn't know what to do, didn't know who to help first. We were in the middle of nowhere, upside down in a ditch, and none of us had any idea if help was coming or if we would just bleed out there in the dark. Marco managed to kick out the back window. I heard the glass give way and then saw him crawling out into the mud, dragging himself on his elbows because something was wrong with his legs. He was cursing the whole time, a steady stream of words I could barely make out through the rain. I turned back to check on Alina, and that was when I saw her arm. It was bent at an angle that arms don't bend, the bone pushing up against the skin like it was about to break through. She was conscious, but her eyes had this glazed faraway look, like her brain had shut down to protect her from the pain. Jenna was the least injured somehow, just cuts and bruises from what I could see. She climbed out after Marco and immediately started screaming for help into the darkness, her voice swallowed up by the storm. I stayed with Trevor and Alina, trying to keep them both awake, talking to them about anything I could think of. I told Trevor about the time we skipped class freshman year to go fishing. I told Alina about how Trevor had talked about proposing to her after they both found jobs. Stupid things, desperate things, anything to keep them with me. My phone was destroyed. The screen cracked into a spiderweb of broken glass. Marco's phone had flown out of his hand during the crash, and we never found it. But Jenna still had hers somehow tucked into the pocket of her jacket. She called 911 and tried to explain where we were, but none of us knew. We had been on some state highway heading south toward San Antonio, but we couldn't remember which one or how far we had gone. The dispatcher kept asking for landmarks, for mile markers, for anything that could help them find us. All Jenna could say was that we were in a ditch, that it was dark, that our friends were dying. That last word hit me like a punch to the chest. Dying. I hadn't let myself think it until she said it out loud. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, said they would try to trace the call, told us to keep everyone as still as possible. The rain kept coming down, and the minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. I held Trevor's hand and watched his chest rise and fall, counting each breath like it might be his last. The ambulance took 43 minutes to find us. I know because Jenna's phone showed the call duration when they finally arrived. 43 minutes of sitting in the rain in the dark watching my best friend slip in and out of consciousness. At some point, Alina started shivering uncontrollably, her whole body shaking despite the fact that it wasn't even that cold out. Shock, I know now. Her body was shutting down. Marco had dragged himself to a tree and was leaning against it, his face pale and his lips turning a bluish color that terrified me. When I finally saw the flashing lights up on the road, I started crying. Not quiet tears, but ugly heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. The paramedics had to rappel down into the ditch because it was too steep for a stretcher. They put a neck brace on Trevor and strapped him to a board, and it took 4 of them to carry him back up to the road. I refused to leave until everyone else was out. Stood there in the mud with my dislocated shoulder and my bleeding head, watching them pull my friends out of that hole one by one. The hospital is a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, and people asking me questions I couldn't answer. They popped my shoulder back into place without warning, and I screamed so loud a nurse came running from down the hall. 13 stitches in my forehead, a concussion, 2 cracked ribs I didn't even know I had. But I was the lucky one. Marco had shattered both his kneecaps and needed surgery that same night. Alina's arm was broken in 3 places, and she had internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. Jenna had a fractured collarbone and whiplash so bad she couldn't turn her head for weeks. And Trevor, the one who had sworn he could drive through anything, was in a medically induced coma for 5 days. Traumatic brain injury, they said, swelling in his skull. They had to drill a hole to relieve the pressure. His parents flew in from Michigan, and his mom grabbed me by the shoulders in the waiting room, asking me what happened, asking me why we didn't stop, asking me questions I've been asking myself every single day since. Trevor woke up on the 6th day. He didn't remember the crash, didn't remember the curve or the rain or the guardrail. The last thing he recalled was passing the Texas border and Marco handing him the whiskey bottle. The doctor said that was normal, that the brain protects itself by erasing trauma. I wished my brain would do the same. Instead, I remember everything. The sound of Alina screaming, the way the car felt when it left the ground, the smell of blood and gasoline mixing with rain. Trevor spent 18 days in the hospital and another nearly 3 months in physical therapy, relearning how to walk in a straight line. Marco still walks with a limp and probably always will. Alina never got full range of motion back in her arm. She and Trevor broke up about 7 months after the accident. Not because of any fight, but because every time she looked at him, she saw that night. That is what she told Jenna. Anyway, some things just break in ways that can't be fixed. It has been nearly 18 months now, and I still can't drive at night. The moment the sun goes down and I am behind a wheel, my chest gets tight and my vision starts to tunnel, and I have to pull over before I have a full panic attack. I take medication for it, see a therapist every other week, do all the things you are supposed to do. But some nights I still wake up at exactly 2:03 in the morning, the time the crash happened according to the police report. And I am back in that ditch hanging upside down, blood in my eyes, Trevor not answering when I call his name. The five of us don't really talk anymore. Not because anyone is angry, but because being together means remembering. Means looking at Marco's limp or Alina's stiff arm or the scar on my forehead and reliving the worst night of our lives. We saved a $100 by not stopping at that motel. We saved a $100 and it cost us everything else. I tell this story now because I need someone to understand that it can happen to you. One bad decision, one moment of thinking you are invincible, and suddenly you are upside down in the dark wondering if you are going to die. Pull over, get the motel. It is not worth it. Nothing is worth it. Story 9. Elise and I left Colorado Springs on a Friday afternoon in October of 2023, heading south toward Santa Fe, where her sister lived with her husband and 2 kids. We had been married 7 years by then, and this late autumn trip had become something of a tradition for us, a chance to escape our routines and spend a few days with family before the chaos of December set in. I had just clocked out from the warehouse where I had worked since finishing school back in 2016, and Elise picked me up right at the gate so we could hit the road without wasting any time. She was the planner between the two of us, the one who mapped out rest stops and calculated arrival times down to the minute. And she had a whole system for these drives. Cooler packed with sandwiches and fruit, thermos of black coffee, a playlist of true crime podcasts queued up on her phone. I loved watching her in those moments before a trip, the way she double-checked everything and made little notes in the margins of her printed directions. That afternoon, she was wearing my old college sweatshirt and had her hair pulled back in a messy bun. And I can remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who still made me smile after all those years together. She kissed me on the cheek as I slid into the driver's seat and told me we would be at her sister's place by sunrise. We crossed into New Mexico around 8:45 that night, the landscape growing darker and more sparse with every mile south of Clayton. The highway cut through hills and valleys that seemed to swallow the light, and there were stretches where the only thing visible was the white line at the edge of the road and the faint glow of distant ranch lights. Elise had dozed off somewhere around 10:25, her head tilted against the passenger window with my jacket rolled up beneath her cheek. I kept the radio on low. Some local station playing old country songs interrupted by static whenever we passed through a dead zone. The temperature outside had dropped into the low 30s, and I could feel the cold seeping through the gaps in the car's old weather stripping. We were driving a Honda CR-V that had belonged to my father before he passed, and it had close to 188,000 miles on it, but still ran like a dream. Around 12:05, somewhere on a lonely stretch of I-25 between Clayton and Moriarty, New Mexico, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear-view mirror approaching fast. A dark pickup truck pulled up alongside us, and the driver started honking his horn while gesturing frantically toward the back of our car. I slowed down and rolled my window partway, squinting against the cold wind that rushed into the cabin. The man in the truck was yelling something I couldn't quite make out, but he kept pointing at our rear tire and making a slashing motion with his hand. Elise stirred awake beside me, blinking in confusion as she tried to understand what was going on. I told her someone was flagging us down, said it looked like we might have a flat or something dragging underneath. She rubbed her eyes and leaned forward to peer out the windshield at the truck that had now pulled ahead of us. The driver had his hazards on and was slowing to a stop on the wide shoulder about 50 yards up the road. I remember hesitating for just a second, something in my gut telling me to keep driving, but the logical part of my brain took over. If we really did have a flat tire, Driving on it would destroy the rim and leave us stranded in an even worse spot. I pulled off behind the truck, our headlights illuminating the back of a mud-splattered Ford F-150 with Arizona plates. The man stepped out and walked toward us, and I could see now that he was tall, maybe 6 feet 3 inches or 4, wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I told Elise to stay in the car and keep the doors locked while I checked things out. She nodded, still half asleep, and I stepped out into the freezing night air with my phone flashlight ready. The man met me halfway between our vehicles, and up close, I could see he was somewhere in his 40s, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they had spent decades doing hard labor. He had a friendly enough smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and he told me he had been driving behind us for a few miles and noticed sparks coming from our back left tire. I thanked him and walked around to check, crouching down to get a better look. The tire seemed fine to me, fully inflated, no visible damage, no loose hubcap or anything that would cause sparks. I stood up and turned to tell him it looked okay, and that is when I saw he had moved much closer than before. He was standing maybe 3 feet away now, his smile gone, replaced by an expression I still can't describe properly. It was blank, completely empty, like a mask someone had forgotten to put features on. I asked him if he saw which tire it was, trying to keep my voice steady, and he just tilted his head slightly to one side without answering. The next few seconds happened so fast that my memory has broken them into fragments, like photographs shuffled out of order. I remember turning back toward our car, wanting to put distance between myself and this man whose whole demeanor had shifted into something predatory. I remember seeing Elise's face through the windshield, her eyes wide with alarm as she watched the scene unfold. And then I felt a hand grab my shoulder from behind, thick fingers digging into the muscle hard enough to leave bruises I would still have a week later. I spun around and saw something metal flash in the dim glow of the headlights. A blade about 6 and long that he had pulled from somewhere inside his jacket. He didn't say a word. He just swung at me in a horizontal arc aimed at my throat, and the only reason he missed was because I stumbled backward and tripped over my own feet. I hit the gravel hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, and I heard Elise scream from inside the car. The man stepped over me like I wasn't anything more than an obstacle, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he walked calmly toward the driver's side door where Elise was fumbling with her phone. I scrambled to my feet, yelling for her to run, to get out the other side and run into the darkness where he couldn't follow. But she was panicking, her fingers not cooperating as she tried to unlock her phone and call for help. The man reached the car and slammed his fist against the window, so hard I thought the glass would shatter. Elise screamed again and finally threw herself across the center console toward the passenger door, but she was tangled in the seat belt she had forgotten to unbuckle. I ran at him from behind, not thinking, just reacting on pure adrenaline and terror. I tackled him around the waist, and we both went down onto the pavement, the knife skittering out of his grip and sliding somewhere beneath our car. He was stronger than me, much stronger, and within seconds, he had flipped our positions and pinned me to the ground with his knee on my chest. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something sour on his breath as he wrapped both hands around my throat. The world started going gray at the edges, sounds becoming muffled and distant, and the last thing I saw before my vision tunneled was Elise finally bursting out of the passenger door and running toward the empty highway. Then, his weight suddenly lifted off me, and I heard his footsteps pounding away in the direction she had gone. I lay there gasping for air, my throat burning, and my vision slowly coming back into focus. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, and when I tried to call out for Elise, only a rasping whisper came out. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, then staggered upright, using the side of our car for support. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and silent, except for the wind howling across the open plain. I couldn't see Elise. I couldn't see the man. The darkness beyond our headlights was absolute, a wall of black that could have been hiding anything. I stumbled forward, following the direction I had seen her run, my legs barely cooperating as the adrenaline started to fade and the pain set in. I called her name over and over, my voice getting stronger with each attempt, but the only answer was the wind. About 200 yards from the car, I found her shoe, a white sneaker she had been wearing since we left Colorado Springs, lying on its side in the middle of the road. I picked it up and kept walking, kept calling, kept praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I found her maybe 50 yards further, just off the shoulder where the gravel gave way to scrub brush and frozen dirt. She was lying on her back, completely still, her eyes open and staring at the stars. The front of her sweatshirt, my old college sweatshirt, was dark and wet in a way that I understood immediately but refused to accept. I dropped to my knees beside her and grabbed her hand, and it was still warm, still felt like her, but there was no pulse beneath my fingers. I kept saying her name, kept telling her to wake up, kept promising that help was coming and everything would be okay. But she didn't blink. She didn't breathe. The wound across her throat was deep, almost surgical in its precision, and the blood had already stopped flowing because there was none left to flow. I don't know how long I knelt there holding her hand in the freezing dark. It could have been few minutes or an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything at all. At some point, I became aware of headlights approaching from the north, a semi-truck that slowed as it passed our abandoned car, and then pulled onto the shoulder when the driver saw me kneeling in the brush. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Dale, and he called 911 while wrapping his own jacket around my shoulders because I had started shaking so violently I could barely speak. The police arrived first. 2 state troopers in separate vehicles with their lights painting the desert in alternating flashes of red and blue. Then came the ambulance, then more police, then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Marcus Vale. I told them everything I could remember, my voice hollow and mechanical as I described the truck, the man, the fake warning about our tire. They took photographs of the bruises on my throat, the scrapes on my palms from hitting the gravel, the shoe I was still clutching in my hands like some kind of talisman. Someone draped a thermal blanket over me and guided me to the back of an ambulance where a paramedic checked my vitals and shined a light in my eyes. I watched from there as they set up a perimeter around Elisa's body, as they photographed the scene from every angle, as they eventually covered her with a white sheet that seemed to glow against the dark ground. I kept expecting to wake up, kept waiting for the nightmare to end, and find myself back in our apartment with Elise beside me, complaining that I had stolen all the blankets again. But the cold was too real, the pain in my throat too sharp, the image of her empty eyes burned too permanently into my memory. The investigation moved faster than I expected, though the days and weeks that followed are mostly a blur of police stations and funeral arrangements and phone calls I don't remember making. The pickup truck was found abandoned 2 days later at a rest stop near Santa Fe, wiped clean of fingerprints, but not clean enough to erase everything. Forensic technicians pulled DNA from a cigarette, but in the ashtray, and a partial fingerprint from the rear-view mirror that the killer had missed. They matched both to a man named Calvin Rusk, 47 years old, with a record of assault charges in 3 different states and a warrant out of Texas for a similar attack on a couple near Lubbock 2 years earlier. That couple had survived barely because another driver happened to pull over before Rusk could finish what he started. The FBI joined the case when they connected him to at least 2 other highway attacks across the Southwest. A pattern of violence targeting travelers on isolated stretches of road late at night. They found him 19 days after Elise died, hiding in a trailer park outside of Kingman, Arizona, living under a fake name and working cash jobs at a nearby ranch. He didn't resist when they came for him. According to the agents who made the arrest, he smiled when they read him his rights, like the whole thing was some kind of game he had finally gotten tired of playing. The trial took place in Santa Fe the following summer, and I sat in that courtroom every single day for 3 weeks straight. Elisa's sister sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tight it left marks, and together we listened as prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The DNA, the fingerprints, the testimony from the couple in Texas who identified Rusk as the man who had attacked them on a lonely highway outside of Lubbock. I had to testify too. Had to sit on that stand and describe every detail of the worst night of my life, while Rusk watched me from the defense table with that same blank expression I remembered from the road. His lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have been driving that truck, but the jury saw through it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. And when they let him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned and looked directly at me. He didn't say anything, didn't smile, just stared for several seconds before the bailiffs pushed him through the door. I have seen that look in my dreams more times than I can count. It has been a little over 18 months now, and I still can't drive at night without feeling my chest tighten and my breathing go shallow. I sold the Subaru, sold our apartment, moved to a small town in Maine where Elise and I had always talked about retiring someday. Her sister checks in on me every few days, sends me photos of her kids who are growing up so fast, reminds me that Elise would want me to keep living even when living feels impossible. I go to therapy twice a week and take medication that helps me sleep without dreaming. Some days are better than others. Some days I can almost convince myself that I am healing, that the weight on my chest is getting lighter, that eventually I will be able to remember Elise without seeing her lying in that frozen dirt with her eyes full of stars. But then I will hear a car horn honk unexpectedly, or see a dark pickup truck in a parking lot, or notice someone walking a little too close behind me, and all of it comes rushing back like it happened yesterday. I am sharing this because I need people to understand that these things happen to real people on ordinary nights when they are just trying to get from one place to another. If someone flags you down on an empty road, don't stop. Keep driving. Call 911 and let them check it out. Because the few minutes you save by being a good Samaritan might cost you everything you have ever loved.